Alright, I am finally back with a new video. This one is about Zed. And once again, there are no spoilers up front, I'll let you know when there will be some. Zed is a game that was spearheaded by a man named Chuck Carter and was launched on Kickstarter in June of 2016, about 4 years before it was released. It's a small, story-driven game about a dying man trying to finish an illustrated book for his granddaughter while also fighting against his failing memory. You can finish it in around an hour and a half, and at the time of writing this, it's about $20. However, it only has a 58% positive review on Steam, and I think that's where we should start. And I'm not going to say that it does or doesn't deserve that, we'll get into what I think about it in a bit, but from what I saw, a good chunk of the early negative reviews for the game were based around the disparity between the Kickstarter promises and the final product. So let's discuss this Kickstarter issue right now, since it'll make for a nice segue back later. I also want to discuss how the game is, and not what was originally expected or promised, so I think getting this out of the way first will be helpful. Zed was described on the Kickstarter page as a game about a dying man, desperately trying to remember parts of his life so that he could leave behind a legacy for his granddaughter. These fractured memories would be represented as puzzles within the game, and these puzzles could only be solved if you carefully took note of everything in the environment. Solving the puzzles would help bridge the memories, allowing the man to continue the book for his granddaughter. Your character was going to be an entity trying to help him remember, but since the dying man didn't know you, he might try to help or hinder your progress. Since this game was made by Chuck Carter, one of the people who developed the original Myst game, the assumption was that this would be a modern-day Myst, and judging by the description on the Kickstarter page, that's probably what they had originally intended. Without going into too much detail, the team ran out of money before they could finish the game, and were close to abandoning it. They ended up partnering with Cyan Ventures, an offshoot of the group that Chuck had worked with on Myst way back when, and got the funds to finish the game. I think for many outside observers, and I conclude myself in this also doubled down on the idea that this would be a new Myst-style game. However, somewhere in that transition, the game had to be scaled back considerably. It was redeveloped as a much smaller narrative-only game, and in place of the missing content, they added in a virtual reality option. So that's where we are now and how we're going to approach it. A narrative-driven game with VR elements. But let me be clear, this is not a puzzle game anymore. Although there are a few puzzles, they are so small in scale and difficulty that I hesitate to even call them puzzles. I'm also going to be ignoring the VR side of things for my review, partially because I don't think adding VR really changed that much about the game, but mostly because I don't have the ability to record in VR. Zed, as it stands now, maintained that core story about the man dying and trying to remember details so that he can finish the book for his granddaughter. It's told by the narrator, sometimes referred to as the Dreamer, who's voiced by Stephen Russell.
It's important to accomplish something with our life.
If you play a lot of Bethesda games, this is a voice you'll likely recognize. The gameplay is fairly straightforward. Each level, if you will, consists of some upfront story dialogue, followed by the player exploring and finding objects that are significant to the narrator, a very quick puzzle to solve, and moving on to the next area. Each time you find an object, a new page is added to your journal with an image of the object and a reminiscing thought jotted down underneath it. This may be an opportune time to bring this up as well. Although the game officially supports a 21:9 display resolution, if you happen to choose that, the game does not adjust properly and you end up losing the bottom of the screen, cutting off the journal, which makes it difficult to read some of the entries, as well as cutting off the bottom of the options menu itself, making it difficult to adjust anything else afterwards. There's also no way to disable the music or adjust any of the audio levels other than the main volume, making recording gameplay for this just a little more difficult. Alright, so here's your spoiler warning. We're about to dive into the plot of the game and then discuss the mechanics of it all. I will say up front that although the story in Zed is good, there isn't much you can miss, so its replay value is fairly minimal, so if you have any intention of playing this game, I'd recommend stopping the video now. Zed opens up in a living room. A hospital bed placed in one corner and the stereotypical heart rate monitor beeping to reinforce it. There are two people talking. A doctor describes a person who's unable to access memories even though the memories are still there.
Your father's problem? Retrieval.
And then describes using games to stimulate their brain in order to help them remember.
Some games have proven effective in preserving cognitive function.
A second person speaks up and mentions that her father is trying to create a picture book for her daughter.
He's making a picture book for my daughter, Charlotte.
I'm not really sure why, but the doctor then switches it up and asks the woman what her most important memories are.
Now tell me, what are your most important memories?
In the creepiest voice possible.
Get this.
The audio kind of changes and it's now seemingly random samples of other people talking, finishing up with the sound of a car crash.
You never should have signed that contract.
You're then left to explore the home. There's not much to find or do here, just a few stuffed animals that squeak when you click on them, and for some reason you can flush the toilet. Those are the only things that you can interact with. There's also some art on the wall that will become important later. When you're done looking around, you can leave through the front door where it fades to black and you're presented with a title card for Chapter 6.
What is this place? What are we doing here?
After a few moments, it fades back in and you're now in a hallway lined with doors and full of strange objects. Some of these objects appear later in the game, but for now it's just random junk. The narrator speaks, trying to remember why we're in this area, and remembers the doctor talking about the game and how important it is for Charlotte that he remembers.
It's important for Charlotte.
So that's the loose intro to the story. You represent the mind of this man who's dying, having trouble remembering his creative inspirations, and you're playing this memory game to try to drudge up enough memories to finish the picture book for your granddaughter Charlotte. One important thing to note here is that there are actually two narrators speaking, Ego and Id. I turned the subtitles on for this recording to avoid confusion, and I don't know if it was just me, but I didn't even realize that it was two separate people talking since it was the same voice actor for both, and his tone is not that different. It's somewhat obvious in retrospect, but I think they could have introduced this better. And if you're like me, you'll spend an inordinate amount of time trying to open these doors on the walls looking for secrets, but I can assure you right now that none of them open. When you reach the end of the hallway, you pass through into another room, this one looking more normal. The narrators speak up again and try to figure out the goal.
Work the problem. What's the goal?
They decide that they just want to gather enough memories to finish the book for Charlotte.
Gather the memories. Create the book for Charlotte.
This room is lined with sketches and finished art and looks almost like a gallery. In the center of the room is a pedestal with an object on it, which looks like the Eager Games logo. Clicking on it will bring it closer to you and allow you to examine it. After that, it will bring up your journal and fill out a new entry with the narrator's thoughts on the object. Once you're done reading it, you put your journal away and you'll notice that some floating tiles have appeared near the opposite door. Okay, so remember at the beginning when I said there were a few puzzles in the game? This is the extent of them. They're all tile puzzles, and with the exception of this first one, they're all 3x3. This first one, I guess being the tutorial puzzle, is only 2x2. I'll come back to these later, but for now, you complete the puzzle and the door opens to the next area. This area is in black and white, and a quick look around suggests that this is in the far past. This is the same location that you were in the beginning, and it's unclear to me if this was intentional or just a reused asset. The narrator explains that this was the time that he met Mal, a classmate of his that was a writer, and a new voice, presumably Mal, gives some appreciation for some drawings the narrator did, names the character Zed, and suggests that they collaborate to make a comic book. The narration stops and it switches back to music. Then begins the gameplay cycle that will continue until the end of the game. There are 4 objects that you will need to find before the area's puzzle will appear. Each time you find one of these objects, your journal will populate with a brief description of why this object was important to him, or some other reminiscing thought about it. Finally, you'll complete the area's puzzle and then move on to the next area. The next area is one that you'll be returning to often. It's an abstract area that only loosely seems to tie in with anything that's going on otherwise. So, the puzzles that you complete in each scene are supposed to be the memories that you're digging up, and I believe, but I don't know, that this area is supposed to represent bringing that idea back to your mind. There's always some kind of bridge that leads you back to the center island, so in my mind, this is the bridge that you're rebuilding to reconnect the memory. It doesn't really make any sense, since you're not returning here after every puzzle, but that's the best that I could figure. You hear Mal's voice again, and he talks about how excited he is to work on the Zed comics over the summer.
Horror, comedy, romance.
Finally, at the end of the area, there's an elevator that you get on to move you to the next scene. This scene opens up in a sewer. The narrator explains that this is his mind manifesting as a self-deprecated metaphor, that his whole life was awful and that he was a terrible person.
Rancid remains of a self-centered life.
One thing I'd like to note though, later on Mal mentions that they were exploring some sewer tunnels, so this isn't really a metaphor, it's just a memory. After a brief pause, the narrator picks back up and wonders how his daughter Ruthie is doing.
Hey, I wonder how Ruthie's doing anyway.
The second narrator corrects him that his daughter was named Rose and that his dog was named Ruthie. I don't know why, but in my first playthrough, I still hadn't figured out that the narrator was two people, and I just thought this was his bad memory conflicting with himself. You can explore the entirety of the sewer, but there isn't much to find or see. There are a few alleyways, but they all lead to dead ends. I'm going to pause this for a second to bring up why this is the case. There's an achievement in the game for finding the 4 stuffed animals in each area. They are frequently hidden, and the sewer level has a few branches specifically for finding them. The issue is, if you aren't looking for them, as you probably aren't on your first playthrough, this is a somewhat long corridor that just ends in a dead end. Anyways, you find the 4 items, finish the puzzle, and move on to the next area. This is another area that you'll be returning to a few times, though its purpose is unclear to me even after finishing the game. I think the idea is that this is the time when the narrator is drawing the images into the book, but I'm kind of stretching for an answer. There's a drafting table with a partially finished sketch on it, and there are several finished images from the book on the walls. In either case, you hear Mal's voice again, and he pitches a few ideas for the direction of the Zed comic.
One story he's this loser superhero, next he's on ancient Mars.
There are no puzzles or items in this room. After the narration, the door opens to the next scene. The next area is a street, clearly sometime around Halloween. The narrator speaks up and says this is the neighborhood where they live, though it looks different to him now. He believes this is more of a representation, a fantasy version, as opposed to how it actually looks or looked. The irony to me is that this is actually the least abstract map aside from the house that you started in. The narrators explain that they're knee-deep in a creative wellspring and that they should take advantage of it. They instead just explain their memories of childhood, I guess the idea being that their creativity came from real-life experiences. Find the items, solve the puzzle, next area. Our first return to the abstract area. Mal asks how much art you got done, and the implication is that you haven't done any, and that instead of focusing on it over the summer like you ostensibly agreed to, you chose to do other things. This is the first indication to me that Mal was a lot more invested in Zed than the narrator was. The next area you're in is a park. Mal asks if you're going to the art show and then mentions that they're going to go smash pumpkins afterwards. The narrator chimes in and talks about how much he likes pumpkins.
Pert and plump. Pleasurable.
Or something.
You're creeping me out.
This area is probably my favorite. I think it looks really whimsical and fantasy, but isn't too abstract. For the most part. The music here is pretty fantastic as well. The next area is in the woods. The narrator mentions that a witch lived here, and the other narrator may have had a crush on her.
You had a crush on the neighborhood necromancer.
That's about it for this area. And we find ourselves back at the second recurring area. This time, a new section has opened up. The narrator speaks up, leaving a voicemail for Mal. Apparently, the two of them sold the rights to the comic book to a company called Plimco, and once Plimco had the rights, they cut the two of them out and banned them from doing any illustrations related to it. Finally, recently, Plimco sold the rights to make a movie. We start Chapter 4 in a baby's room, with a lullaby in the background. The narrator doesn't seem to look super fondly on this memory, but the reason isn't clear yet. In this room, the stuffed animals are actually the objects to collect. Very quickly, we move on to the next scene. It fades back in, and we're now in a basement. The narrator describes this place was special to him not because of any particular thing, but because this area was off limits, and that made it special. The narrator disagrees with the narrator on this.
A stash of girly mags does not a mystery make. He cursed, he drank,
Next scene you're at is a train station. The narrator describes how this place represented the bad of being shipped off to his grandfather's place, but also the good of returning home. The implication here is that he had a negative relationship with his grandfather and resented being forced to visit him. Once again, back at the abstract area. The narration is Mal leaving a voicemail for the narrator, mentioning that the filming for the Zed movie is starting soon and that he's annoyed that they didn't even consult him on it. He did manage to get a copy of the script and he thought it was decent. You take an elevator ride to the next area, which opens up in some kind of cave. This is the pivotal emotional scene. You learn a lot about the main character here. The items you collect reveal that the narrator drinks a lot, cheats on his wife, and never really connected with his children. The narrator explains his realization that he's just as bad at being a father as his father was for him.
And judging from the way things turned out, we're no better at being a dad than Dad.
It culminates with finding a car wreck. There's a blurred voice speaking, presumably of his wife. Combined with the narrator's dialogue, the implication is that his wife and son did not survive the accident.
We never got to know him. Yeah, let's face it, we never really knew her either.
And we end up on the bathroom floor. I thought this was going to be a dramatic scene about the narrator's reaction to the death of his wife and child, but the narrator explains this is actually the memory of the death of his father, who was also an alcoholic and philanderer. The implication based on the items that you find around is that he shot himself. He was only 45 when he died, and I'm left wondering if it had anything to do with the loss of his daughter-in-law and grandchild, but it's kind of hard to make that connection because the narrator shows nothing but contempt for him even now.
A mostly meaningless life, cut short by ignominious end.
Back to this recurring room, you have another voicemail from Mal detailing the initial reviews of the Zed movie, which were terrible.
A lifeless, soulless husk of a summer film.
Mal also says that he watched it and that there was no passion in making the film. He also explains that he hasn't seen a penny in commissions from the company, so he tried to charge for sketches at a convention and the company threatened to sue him. On to Chapter 3. We're back in the home and the narrator talks about he and his wife were in the process of getting divorced. Or maybe that they were already divorced? Hard to say. I assume they were already divorced, otherwise this scene would have happened before the accident. It's not surprising that she divorced him, he explains. Aside from the drinking and cheating, he was also extremely messy and was always at the art studio. So we head over to the art studio. Turns out it's just a shed in the back with a leaking roof and lots of junk all over. We spend a weirdly small amount of time here, considering how important this room must have been for him, and move on. You head back to the abstract area with another voicemail from Mal. He shares his remorse for the narrator's lost child and for leaving lots of voicemails complaining about Zed while all of that was going on. Mal realizes now that he's the only one hanging on to Zed and wants to move on to something new. This sort of reinforces my idea from earlier. I don't know that the narrator was as invested in Zed as Mal was. Sort of seems like he came up with the idea, worked with Mal a bit to perfect it, and then just moved on to the next big thing, probably long before they sold it to Plimco. The next scene is a little disjointed. It talks briefly about the narrator's time in college, meeting a guy named Lenny, who I think was supposed to be a druggie. He talks briefly about his first solo show, which I believe was supposed to be an art exhibit. It's a little hard to hear at times, since this giant spinning eager logo is overwhelmingly loud for no apparent reason.
Broken bussing tables. Found this book through a many splendored lens.
This is definitely the most interesting area visually, though. Now we find ourselves in a gross scene. Yes, giant ticks on the wall. We can move on from here pretty quick, but the key point is that the narrator wonders aloud how Mal is doing, and the other narrator chimes in asking, "You don't remember?" Back at the abstract area, you have another voicemail from Mal. This time he sounds sick and starts coughing a lot.
Been a bit.
It's implied that he's dying, and his last wish is for the narrator to finish Zed's story. Continuing on, you have a voicemail from your daughter, ostensibly replying to a message that you sent to her. She agrees to your request to reconnect and then reveals that she's pregnant.
I'm pregnant. We're pregnant.
The next scene opens with the narrator coughing like crazy, surrounded by cigars and complaining that the smoke reminds him of his grandfather. I guess the thought was that becoming a grandfather sparked the memory of his own grandfather, or maybe Mal's coughing did the trick. He says that he's just lucky that he didn't start smoking, which is kind of weird because my impression was that he did start smoking at one point. The rest of the scene is some kind of industrial machine. I'm not really certain what it's supposed to represent. One item gives a lot of insight, though. After losing his wife and child, he turned to drinking heavily. Mal's message convinced him to turn his life back around by giving him a goal: finish Zed. We return to the abstract area, only this time it's in black and white. You have a voicemail from your daughter. Apparently the company that bought the rights to Zed has been sued numerous times, and she thinks that they may have a chance to win back the rights to Zed. Also, she's having a daughter named Charlotte. The scene's in a graveyard. You visit the grave of your wife and son, as well as a few others. Seems like he's reflecting on what he's lost in order to move on. Back to the abstract area, there's a voicemail from your daughter again, congratulating you on getting the rights back to Zed, which is shared for your whole family as well as Mal's, and she expresses remorse at the fact that Mal died. Final chapter. The narrator talks about this being the end. We now have all the memories we need to complete the book. The items you find have touching entries and make for a fitting sign-off. It seems he did indeed turn his life around and is somewhat congratulating himself. One last trip back to this location with another voicemail from your daughter. She's concerned because you left the stove on, and the implication is that your memory was already fading. A final trip back to the home. This time, mostly empty and bright white. The narrator explains that he has everything he needs now to finish the book, and the daughter takes over and thanks you for making the book and dedicating it to Charlotte.
Thank you, Dad. I'll read it to Charlotte every night.
The scene fades out, making the obvious implication that the narrator died. It fades back in, only this time it's radically different again. A new voice, identifying herself as Charlotte, speaks, explaining that she's headed to college to become a rocket scientist now and has a good life going on. The bedroom opens up, and you can see a lot of the props from the game, along with the finished book on the table. You can open the book and read it. It's titled Where's Charlotte? And features some of the completed images from the puzzles that you completed within the game. It's a beautifully emotional scene and ties everything together. When you reach the end, it fades out and heads to the credits. And that's the end. Interestingly enough, if you wanted to go back and reread the book after you finished it, you can't, because the game automatically fades out. Okay, so I'd like to dissect some of the plot elements, and at the top of my list is the whole memory game aspect. The core idea of Zed is that the narrator is having trouble remembering things, and that you're supposed to be helping him recover those memories. But it never really feels like he actually forgot anything, or is even having trouble remembering anything, especially because all of the narration is front-loaded in the levels. In fact, he actually seems fairly lucid the whole time. There are only a couple of times that it's obvious he forgot something, and it's almost always exclusively the names of his children.
And these toys, think they're Rosie's or the boys? Probably both.
For someone under the stress of dying while rushing to finish a major project and suffering from dementia or some other kind of memory issue, he remembers a lot of details better than the average person. Plus, there's no unlocking or fixing a memory, you're just dropped into it and he immediately remembers everything about the area and his life at the time. Like, you're dropped into this train area and he's immediately talking about how he used to take the train a lot to and from his grandfather's and explains how that made him feel. In the bathroom scene, you don't even get a chance to look around and figure out where you are before he starts in on the meaning of the area. There's another strange decision buried here too. A lot of these levels are meant to be somewhat fantasy versions of ordinary places, played up a little to represent either his failing memory or perhaps the way his childhood memory interpreted them. Pumpkins probably seemed bigger as a child, so giant pumpkins sort of make sense in his memory. But he doesn't play into that at all. He's just like, oh yeah, I remember pumpkins, and then you're in an area with a lot of pumpkins, and that's supposed to represent the creativity of his youth. And then you look at the image he's trying to fabricate at the end, and it has nothing to do with any of it. In fact, not one of the images you solve at the end of the level seem to have anything to do with the level that they're part of, or any levels in general. The whole goal of the game from the start was to reconnect the memories that would help you create the book. What's the point of remembering a train station when the image that you're trying to create is Zed watching a news report on TV? Plus, at least one of the image puzzles you're trying to complete isn't even used in the book at the end, so that doesn't really work either. Along the same lines, these levels are supposed to be areas of creative significance to the narrator, but he never treats them like that. For example, this sewer level was supposed to be a place that Mal and him went to gather ideas for the comic book, but instead of talking about that, he describes how he's a horrible person and how horrible his life was.
Race of bad marriages, broken vows, kids we hardly know.
This was his childhood home street, and here he does talk about the creative wellspring that the area was, and he comes really close to conveying its meaning. He just doesn't try to relate it to Zed at all, which is what I think was missing. I also had trouble discerning the timeline at several times while I played. As an example, in the car crash scene there isn't any confirmation that anyone died, just an implication. Then afterwards you end up back at your home and he makes a big deal out of these divorce papers. Which, and this will probably sound kinda odd, but I actually found way more emotional than when I thought she died. My mind started filling in some blanks about what it must have been like between them after losing one of their children and how it ended up in divorce. But then a few scenes later, you find the grave with both of their names and the same death date. I thought it might have been a memory issue, but I realized on subsequent playthroughs what was going on. I just think that there were a few scenes like that could have been cleaner on their delivery. So part of the core gameplay cycle is finding these objects. There are 4 objects to find in each level before the exit will unlock, and most of these are placed in easy locations to find. But others can be placed in areas you didn't think to look. And while most areas are small, meaning it's easy to double back and find something you missed, others, like this train area, are somewhat larger and a little more labyrinthine. You don't know you've missed one until you make it to the end of the area, and going back and retracing your steps is never fun, especially on this train level where any of the seats could be hiding an item. On my first playthrough, I missed one of the train cars entirely and had to spend an inordinate amount of time doubling back to try to find the part that I missed. Since I didn't know that I had missed an entire train car, I was carefully checking each seat of the other trains to no avail. The objects have a little sparkle coming off of them, which helps a bit, but when you don't know where you missed it, you don't know why you missed it. The car crash level also has an item that I believe was deliberately hidden to force you to double back at the end, which is just kind of annoying since you can't solve the puzzle without finding it first. It really doesn't help much that every time you pick up an object, the whole screen fades to white, which, if you play it in the dark, is blinding given the otherwise darker atmosphere. While we're on the subject of these puzzles, let's dive into that, because I'm not even really sure why they're here. If I had to guess, I'd say the idea was a carryover from the original idea of the game, where the puzzles were going to be more integral to the memories. As it stands now, though, I don't think they should have bothered. In my playthrough, these puzzles took me only a few moments to solve, and even if you're struggling, the image itself is projected somewhere in the level for you to cross-reference. The longest that any of the puzzles actually took me was this one, clocking in at a whopping 47 seconds. The idea that you're fixing a broken memory is awesome, but as I mentioned before, none of these images are related to the memories, and I can think of several ways of conveying that idea much better than a 3x3 tile puzzle. Another minor issue that I have with these is that when you complete them, they hang just a little too long. It's like the devs knew that you were going to complete them too fast to actually get a good look, so they wanted you to stop and admire them for a moment. In between each of the levels, there is a fade to black loading screen. Loading screens themselves aren't really a big deal to me, it's just something you sort of have to accept from games, and Zed's levels loaded fairly quickly, so no problems there. The only complaint that I do have here is that since the next room isn't loaded in, the door tries to project an image of the room. It does so by using this projected box. It's actually kind of hard to describe. It just doesn't look good. You can easily see the boxy corners, and the low-res version of the next room is kind of off-putting. I'm sure the idea here was just to entice you to walk through, which you would lose if the door was just black or something, but I can't let that slide. The environments are one thing this game has going strong, and this just felt like a sloppy addition. Oh right, the music cuts out if it's playing during the transition, so there's that. So, a couple times now I've mentioned parts that I felt the narrator should have related or connected to Zed more, and you're probably wondering why I'm such a stickler for that since the plot was mostly fine without it. Well, my biggest confusion over the game called Zed is that it never really seems like the narrator was that interested in Zed from the get-go. He never really talks about it, and even at the end it seems like he only made the book as a memento to his granddaughter and a promise fulfilled to Mal, not something that he was actually passionate about for himself. And don't get me wrong, that may even be the point. The narrator was being selfish for his whole life, and this was his last chance to do something altruistic. It's a good message. But it just casts a bit of a shadow on the ending to me. This is a little beyond the scope of this review, but personally I feel the thing that makes art special is the connection and passion that the artist has for making it. And I just don't feel that with the narrator at all, because, well, let's look at it in order. The narrator meets Mal and starts making a comic book. At some point, while they're still kids, the narrator starts to lose interest and eventually ends up selling the concept to a company as a quick cash grab in lieu of continuing to work on it himself. Then, decades later, he's basically guilted into revisiting it by his dying friend and decides to double dedicate the book to Mal and his granddaughter. It's still a great story behind that, I just think it lacked a bit of impact due to the lack of passion that the narrator had for Zed. Like, imagine if, instead of bailing on Zed early, the narrator continued to be passionate about it later into his life. Then he loses his drive for art in general after his family loss, and the dying plea from Mal reinvigorated him to finally turn his life around and finish this book with the character that he loved so much, and do some good for his remaining family in the process. Then, making the book for Charlotte and dedicating it to his friend Mal would have felt much more personal. And that's so close to how the story went down that I wouldn't even be surprised if that's what was intended. but the story that I got from the narration is that the narrator only really worked on Zed for a short time before moving on, which made it feel a little less meaningful for him to dedicate his book about it to Charlotte at the end. I started off writing this with the intent to talk about Zed separated from the Kickstarter, to just focus on what the final game turned out to be and not include the promises and such. But here at the end of it, I feel like it might be unfair. What we got was a game that felt half-finished, but that's really only because it was. It's the shell of an amazing game, without the filling. We get these beautifully unique areas to explore and view, but it's obvious that they weren't fully realized, and there's reused assets all over the place. We got this beautiful story that was set up to be a tearjerker, but it feels like it had to be cut down, with the setup for the puzzle environment that wasn't there. And I feel like if you add in the hopes and dreams from the Kickstarter, you can see how this game was going to be amazing. It's really easy to imagine the same game but with a more fleshed out story, bigger areas, and Myst-style puzzles to find and solve. As it stands now, though, it's a decent story told through mediocre gameplay. It's worth a playthrough to experience, but I can't wholeheartedly recommend it. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I'm hoping to have these completed on a more regular basis. The next game that I'm working on is Divinity Original Sin 2. Though that one's turning into a much larger project than I anticipated, so I'm also working on a video for Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which may come out before Divinity. Thanks again, and I'll see you around.